Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Sunday, 4 May 2025. It is the 121st anniversary of the birth of Josef Pieper, who was born in the small German town of Elte in the North Rhine-Westphalia on this date in 1904. Pieper was a 20th century Thomist philosopher. A Thomist is a philosopher who builds on the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, who we now remember as the leading scholastic philosopher of the High Middle Ages, and whose work came to be identified with the theology of the Catholic Church, sometimes referred to as the official theology of the Catholic Church. When the historian James J. Walsh called the 13th the greatest of centuries, one of the leading lights of this greatest of centuries was Aquinas. Sometimes Thomism in the 20th century is called Neo-Thomism or the Thomist revival, but there are a few Thomists who reject that label. Jacques Marichal, for example, another Thomist philosopher of history, explicitly said that he didn't want to be known as a neo-Thomist, but as a Thomist, plain and simple. Josef Pieper then was part of this Thomist tradition. Pieper wrote many devotional works, but his primary contribution to the philosophy of history are his two books, The End of Time, A Meditation on the Philosophy of History, which was originally published in 1954, and Hope and History, 5 Salzburg Lectures, which was originally published in German in 1967, and the English translation appeared in 1969. In The End of Time, A Meditation on the Philosophy of History, Pieper makes a distinction between historical and unhistorical happenings. Quote, "The concepts associated with the essential nature of history are freedom, decision, uniqueness, unrepeatability, uninterchangeability, unpredictable capacity for variation, the individually solitary. By these, historical happening is distinguished from the unhistorical happening of nature. Because this is so, however, because history is not simply the unfolding of something previously given that was not yet unfolded, because it is not simply development. For this reason, in the sphere of history, the concretely future cannot be calculated in advance, neither by the stars nor by statistics. But there may be prophecy. Prophecy is the sole form of prediction coordinated with the essence of history," unquote. Many philosophers of history have made a similar distinction because it's felt that some distinction needs to be made between nature and culture. But here we can see that Pieper immediately makes his distinction serve his religious conception of history. Pieper returns to this distinction in Hope and History, 5 Salzburg Lectures. In a long paragraph that begins chapter 2, Pieper gives something like a definition of history that employs the traditional distinction between natural history and human history. I'm going to read through this paragraph, but I'm going to break it up and comment on it in pieces as I go through it. So the first bit of the paragraph, quote, "History in the wider sense, says the Encyclopedia Britannica, is all that has happened. But there is also a stricter sense of history, which means that there are also unhistorical happenings. Lightning striking, a landslide, the flowing of water, the tides of the sea, everywhere things happen which are not strictly historical events," unquote. So far, this is pretty familiar. Most philosophers of history make some kind of distinction between specifically human events and events that don't seem to involve human beings. Like I said earlier, there seems to be a need to make a distinction between nature and culture. But he goes on, quote, "The germination, growth, flowering, and fruiting of plants seems somewhat closer to what is properly historical, and even more so that an animal is born, grows to maturity, seeks its prey, and perhaps itself becomes the prey of a more powerful predator. Wherever we speak of becoming, we might also with some justification speak of history. It does not run contrary to linguistic usage to call the origin of species, the rise of life, or even the genesis of the entire universe natural history and the history of the cosmos. Nevertheless, in all such usages, the word history is not quite being used in the meaning that gives an event the object of the historian's interest, the proper subject of historical research. It has been said that an episode, say a lightning flash, becomes historical in the exact sense of the word insofar as it has reference to man, unquote. So here Pieper introduces the criterion of event having some reference to man as being that which makes the event historical in the special sense that he identifies as being an object of the historian's interest. Again, this is pretty familiar. If we were to press the idea of some event being an object of the historian's interest too hard, it would give way because it's merely circular. But we don't have to spend any time on this because even though it might be interesting in another context, I should say, where it's made to bear some historiographical weight. For Pieper, it's just a throwaway line, and what's interesting comes next, when Pieper further narrows human history from anything down, I should say, reducing it down from anything that has a reference to man. Quote, "Nevertheless, not everything that happens to us, and not even everything we do, is eo ipso history. Birth, growing up, aging, dying, these physiological events are not our history, if we wish to be precise. And even those objective happenings of our life, gain or loss of property, health, beauty, our innate portion of intelligence, temperament, constitution, or the fact that certain persons cross our paths, a teacher, an adversary, someone we love, in themselves, these incidents and encounters do not constitute our history. What matters is what we ourselves make of them. Only both together determine the full measure of what has really happened." Unquote. Earlier, Pieper seemed to be suggesting that predictable developmental histories in the natural world are close to being history. But here he's saying that these predictable developmental histories, even when true of human beings, aren't history. Thus, even when they have reference to man, events aren't necessarily history in the sense he wants to get at. What is history is what we make of these predictable events of life. Pieper even includes the events that befall us as a result of what we might call our ride on the wheel of fortune, the rota fortunae, which we might see as being particularly constitutive of life, as not being fully historical until we have made something of it all. I don't know of any other philosopher of history who has made this further distinction, narrowing down the events of history to what we do and not merely what happens to us. If we take this distinction seriously, if there is no authentic response to the events that befall us, then we have no history, and we are merely at the mercy of chance. A human life doesn't necessarily have a history, nor does a human society necessarily have a history, if there is no authentically human response to events. This formulation of Pieper would be one way to sharpen Hugh Trevor Roper's dismissive attitude to history that evinces no purposive movement, which others have called ebb and flow history, and which in my episode on Gibbon, I suggested that Gibbon effectively recognizes in relation to the history of Byzantium, that is to say, ebb and flow history at the scale of civilization. Pieper goes on to further explain, quote, "It is then the interlocking of what fate brings our way and our own personal actions in response that truly make for our history in the real, total, and precise sense of the word. In other words, an event becomes historical when the specifically human element operates in it. Freedom, responsibility, decision, and thus also the possibility of error and guilt. Precisely this element, on the other hand, is the reason for the essential singularity and uniqueness of true historical happening, and above all, for the fact that a historical event can in no way be calculated in advance and deduced from what has already happened. Unquote. Pieper isn't exactly arguing that history involves irreducibly unique events. At least he's not arguing that thesis in isolation on its own, as we have become familiar with it from the work of Windelband and Rickert and others who have emphasized the ideographic conception of history. Pieper's conception of history is no less ideographic than theirs, but he's arguing that our specifically human response to events, coupled with human action in the form of freedom, responsibility, and decision, makes these events the unique events that they are. Thus, events are unique not as events, but as events to which human beings have a distinctively human response. The admixture of conscious, purposeful human action with events makes these events so unique that we can't make any claim to predicting the future. The very idea of future history in Pieper's thought is incoherent. Events only become history in the total, real, and precise sense of the word for Pieper when we respond to them with authentic human freedom. That means that history, as it is being made, is continually mixed with freedom, and this in turn means that the future cannot be predicted or calculated, because that would mean the prediction of an authentic human response, which, if it could be predicted, would no longer be free. This brings us to the point of the previous quote in which Pieper had stated that, quote, prophecy is the sole form of prediction coordinated with the essence of history, unquote. Prophecy is consistent with Pieper's sense of history, but prediction is not. Elsewhere, Pieper writes, quote, if provisionally and speaking roughly, we understand by history that happening which takes place through time upon active and passive humanity and through its agency, then he who philosophizes, and this does not mean any professional specialist, most certainly will not. It means any man who meditates upon the roots of things and lovingly seeks wisdom. He who philosophizes asks whether this historical happening means anything over and above the merely factual, and what this meaning may be. He is therefore asking a question which is by no means of the past, but very much of the present, indeed of the future. The question of what the historical process is leading up to. For the man who is spiritually existent, who is directed upon the whole of reality, in other words, for the man who philosophizes, this question of the end of history is quite naturally more pressing than the question of what actually happened, unquote. This, then, is a philosophy of history that is explicitly teleological, but not in the sense of progressivist philosophies of history of the Enlightenment as we have come to expect for teleological conceptions of history. In fact, Pieper's Hope and History, 5 Salzburg lectures, opens with a discussion of Kant as though to clear the air right from the beginning. Pieper says of Kant, in one remark out of the chapter, quote, when we look back on Immanuel Kant's position, we cannot help recalling Kierkegaard's bitter maxim that the deceived are wiser than the undeceived, unquote. Pieper's teleology is explicitly Christian, Catholic, and Thomist. This is a vision of history in which the future is prophecy and hope is one of the central concepts. Not surprisingly, since Ernst Bloch wrote at such great length on hope in his large treatise, The Principle of Hope, Pieper discusses Bloch even with a certain measure of praise. For example, quote, the most forceful statements on the theme of hope, the broadest as well as the deepest analysis in contemporary writing, is undoubtedly to be found in the work of Ernst Bloch, unquote. And hope was, in fact, a central theme for Bloch, as it was for Pieper. As I attempted to describe in my episode on Bloch, Bloch was an unorthodox Marxist with strong religious interests. Pieper, As a Catholic and a Thomist, channeled his religious interest through traditional institutions, so that while both Bloch and Pieper are both intensely interested in the religious life of man, they come across as being nearly antithetical in their interpretation of the religious dimension of human life. Pieper says that something is missing in Bloch's Encyclopedia of Hope. Quote, the endeavor to draw up a comprehensive inventory of the hopes actually cherished by men becomes difficult, for Bloch would limit this list to those hopes which are indeed realizable in this world. Everything else is dismissed from consideration as illusory, unquote. I said a minute ago that Pieper channeled his religious interests through traditional institutions, and Pieper's conception of hope is thoroughly traditional and conventional. He writes, quote, no conception of a future state which simply ignores the fact of death, which leaves out of consideration the fact that men are destined for death, that their lives are a movement toward death, and which likewise ignores all those who have already died. No such picture of the future can seriously claim to be an object of human hope. How can there be any talk of hope when the thing hoped for is so conceived that the being who alone is capable of hoping, namely the individual person, cannot have it? Unquote. For Pieper, hope only has meaning, only can have meaning, when it is cosseted in a framework of soteriology and eschatology. At bottom, Ernst Bloch was a Marxist who saw hope through Marxist spectacles, while Pieper was a Catholic who saw hope through traditional spectacles. I'm not trying to suggest any shallowness or predictability on the part of Pieper, since he does give a good account of himself and his beliefs. But while Pieper gives us a view of conventional orthodoxy, and does so in his discussion of Ernst Bloch, he effectively assimilates all non-orthodox religiosity to an equivalence with Marxism. And I don't think this does justice to the struggle that so many have made to find meaning and hope in history outside a conventional religious framework. And this includes the devoutly religious who entertain no hope of personal immortality. Moreover, while Pieper was right in everything he says of Bloch, everything that Pieper says of Bloch we could apply to, in turn, to Pieper, mutatis mutandis. Marxist hope for a better world and Pieper's hope for another world are alternative formulations of much the same thing. And Pieper more or less implicitly acknowledges this when he's discussing what he called the empirical existence of Christendom. Bloch wanted to focus hopes on what are possible in this world. Pieper rightly responds by asking what is possible and citing several Christian beliefs that inspire incredulity. Quote, who is going to determine what is possible and what is not? Christendom, at any rate, and Christendom, after all, has an empirical existence, insists, indeed its content is, that it is not illusory to hope for an eternal life, for the resurrection of the dead, and also for heaven, unquote. Both Christians and communists have attempted to found social formations based on their hopes for a better world. That is to say, both have sought to embody themselves in empirical existence, and both have come to grief on the same shoal. And this, in my view, is the shoal of individual human variability. Communities of Christian and communist true believers have come together many times in history, only to later fall apart when the next generation is born, when the next generation doesn't share the same fervent beliefs as their parents, beliefs for which true believers will willingly sacrifice, but without the belief, the sacrifice is meaningless. When the pilgrims came to the wilderness of the New World with the intention of founding a new Jerusalem, their efforts endured in its pure form for exactly one generation. The original pilgrims, who were sufficiently motivated to leave their homes in England to embark upon the great work of building an authentic Christian commonwealth, were self-selected. The next generation wasn't. In the next generation, many fell away from Puritanism, and conditions for church membership had to be watered down for the church to remain the central institution of the community. And in the next generation after that, yet more fell away, and church membership was further watered down. The Amish have admirably reckoned with the generational problem and have incorporated the temptations of the outer world into their plan for life so that every young person has a period of running around or rumspringa. The Amish community loses a certain number of young people every year who choose not to return to their way of life, but since they typically have large families, the community continues to grow. So we see that this problem is soluble if all involved are prepared to allow individuals in each generation to choose for themselves. That is to say, the whole community is and remains and continues to be self-selected over historical time. We could imagine doing the same thing with a communist community, and something like this happened with communes during the Back to the Land movement of the 60s and the 70s, or in the previous century, I should say the century before that, with communities like the Shakers. In the US, there's no law that forbids communal living and communal property ownership. And we can imagine a counterfactual history in which 19th or 20th century communes were successful and grew and became the conventional way of life for most of us. But the voluntary communal way of life doesn't suit many of us, so communes remain marginal. Yes, there are still today what people call intentional communities and individuals who are enthusiastic about them. Again, the enthusiasts are a self-selected minority and not the great mass of humanity. If this way of life were attractive to the masses would join, and intentional communities would be the norm. And in fact, there was a time in Western history when retreat from cities became attractive to the masses, and that was when the Roman Empire was collapsing in on itself and Roman cities were depopulated as families fled to estates in the countryside. After this transition, a new way of life became the norm, and it endured for hundreds of years, during which life on landed estates was the expected lot of almost everyone. We could still imagine a future in which some new variant on the theme of intentional communities took off in popularity, and this inflection point eventually led us to a new social order. Toynbee seems to imagine something like this when he predicted that the universal state would give birth to a universal church, which I've characterized elsewhere as a post-civilizational institution. We could even imagine a future in which the conventional orthodoxy of Christendom prevails, and in such a future, Pieper's conception of history might obtain, supervening upon the supernatural beliefs that Pieper thought necessary to hope. So happy birthday, Josef Pieper, and thanks for listening. One more thing, I'm going to be traveling for most of the rest of May, and I don't think I'll have the focus I need to write episodes of Today in Philosophy of History while I'm traveling, so it may be a while before I produce another episode.